My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 72 years old, and I have spent a lifetime taking care of everyone else. I raised my children alone after my husband died young. I worked night shifts as a nurse for 31 years. I survived cancer twice and kept my family afloat through every storm that came our way. I thought I had seen everything life could throw at a person. Then my daughter-in-law stood up in a courtroom, pointed her finger at me like I was a criminal, and screamed words I will never forget for as long as I live, asterisk. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. I was sitting in that courtroom with my hands folded in my lap, trying to stay composed, when she completely lost control. She shot up from her chair so fast it scraped the floor. Her face was red. Her voice cracked the quiet of the room wide open. "She's mentally ill," she screamed, pointing directly at me. "She has always been mentally ill. She is trying to destroy my family." My hands tightened in my lap. My nails pressed into my palms. Every single person in that courtroom turned to look at me, and I felt the heat crawl up my neck and into my face. The judge, a calm, broad-shouldered man with silver-framed glasses, leaned forward slowly. He looked at her with an expression I could not quite read. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" he asked. His voice was quiet, measured, absolutely steady. The room went completely silent. My son, seated 2 rows back, went pale. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. I held my breath and waited. She did not answer the judge. She just stood there, chest heaving, staring at him like she was trying to figure out if she had made a terrible mistake. My mind drifted back, even though I tried to keep it in the present. The first time I truly understood what kind of woman my son had married was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one. I had been visiting for the weekend, and I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, telling someone, her sister, I thought that I was losing my mind and becoming impossible to deal with. I had just returned from a 12-hour shift. I had brought them groceries. I had fixed the leaky faucet in their bathroom because my son never got around to it. She was describing me as a burden before I had even been one. She was laying the groundwork of a story she intended to tell for a long time. I understood that clearly even then. What I did not yet understand was exactly how far she was willing to take it. Back in the courtroom, my lawyer, a quiet and precise man named Wesley Okafor, leaned toward me. "Stay calm," he whispered. "Everything she does right now is working in our favor." I nodded. My heart was hammering, but my face stayed still. That was something decades of nursing had taught me, how to keep your expression steady when everything inside you is moving fast. The judge had asked the bailiff to bring order to the room. She had been instructed to sit down, and she had done so, though her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright with fury. Wesley had told me weeks before this hearing that our strongest asset was the pattern. Not one incident, not one outburst, but the long, unbroken line of behavior that connected all of it together. "We document everything," he had said. "We let the pattern speak." I had spent months doing exactly that, and sitting in that courtroom, I felt for the first time that it had been worth every sleepless hour. The morning of the second court session, my neighbor Constance Keller arrived at the courthouse steps before I did. She was 70 years old, sharp as a tack, and had lived next door to my son and his wife for 4 years. She had seen things. She had written them down because Constance was that kind of person, methodical, careful, unafraid. She handed me a plain manila folder in the hallway outside the courtroom. "I think this belongs with your lawyer," she said softly. Inside were handwritten notes, dated and organized, incidents she had witnessed, conversations she had overheard through open windows. One entry described a night when my daughter-in-law, whose name was Bridget, had stood in the driveway screaming at my son for 40 minutes while their young daughter watched from an upstairs window. I had just closed the folder when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. My son, Nathan, was standing a few feet away. He had seen Constance hand me the folder. His expression was unreadable, and my stomach dropped. That evening, we had dinner together at my son's house. Nathan, Bridget, their daughter Lily, and me. It was tense in the way that only family dinners during legal disputes can be tense. Everyone was performing normalcy and doing it badly. Bridget waited until Nathan left the table to refill drinks. Then she leaned toward me, resting her chin on one hand, and smiled in the way that never reached her eyes. "You're looking tired, Mom," she said. The word Mom always sounded wrong in her mouth. Too soft, like it was covering something sharp. "All this stress can't be good for someone your age. I'm genuinely worried about your memory." I looked at her steadily. I picked up my fork. "I remember everything perfectly," I said. "Always have." She held my gaze for a moment. Then Nathan came back and she shifted instantly into pleasant and relaxed, laughing at something Lily said. But I had noticed something. While she was speaking to me, her phone had buzzed twice on the table beside her plate. She had glanced at it and quickly flipped it face down. Someone was sending her updates. Someone was watching this case from the outside. Over the following 2 weeks, I reached out quietly to people who had known Bridget over the years. I was not hunting for gossip. I was looking for patterns, the same way I used to look for patterns in a patient's chart, small changes that, taken together, told you something the individual numbers could not. What I found was consistent. A former colleague of Bridget's told me she had been let go from her previous job after falsely accusing a supervisor of harassment. The accusation had been investigated and dismissed. The woman told me she had been afraid to speak up at the time, but she would sign a statement now. An old friend of Nathan's confirmed that Bridget had told him, before they were even married, that she intended to limit Nathan's relationship with me. She had said it casually, as if it were a reasonable plan. Each conversation added another piece. And somewhere in all of it, someone mentioned that there were financial records that did not line up with the story Bridget had been telling the court about her income. Wesley called me on a Thursday evening, and his voice had a different quality than usual, more focused, almost electric. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning," he said. "We've received something significant." The document was a set of financial records, obtained legally through the court process, that showed a pattern of transfers over 18 months. Money had been moving from a joint account, one that contained funds Nathan's late father had left specifically for Lily's education, into a personal account held only in Bridget's name. The amounts were not enormous each time, but the total added together was considerable. And more importantly, the transfers had begun 6 weeks after Bridget first started telling Nathan that I was becoming unstable and making things difficult for the family. The timing was not a coincidence. She had started discrediting me around the same time she began moving money. I was meant to be the distraction. The confused, unreliable old woman who nobody would believe. I sat in Wesley's office and felt something settle in my chest, not triumph, not yet, but certainty. The family meeting happened at Nathan's house on a Sunday afternoon, and it was Bridget who called it. She framed it as a chance to clear the air before things go further, but I knew what it really was. She was testing to see how much I knew. She sat across from me with her arms loosely crossed and accused me of paranoia. She used that word 3 times in 10 minutes. She said I had always had trouble trusting people. She said she had tried very hard to make me feel included, and that nothing she did was ever enough. Nathan sat beside her, quiet and conflicted, looking at the floor. I let her finish. Then I looked at her directly and said, "I only deal in facts, Bridget. And the facts are very clear." She stood up. Her chair scraped back hard. "You are doing this to punish Nathan for growing up," she said, her voice rising. "And I will not sit here and be interrogated." She walked out of the room. The front door closed hard enough to rattle the windows. Nathan finally looked at me. I waited. "Mom," he said quietly, "what facts?" That night, alone in my house, I sat in the armchair by the window where I had always done my best thinking. I replayed every cruel thing she had ever said to me, the comments about my age, the whispered suggestions to Nathan that I was confused, forgetful, becoming a liability. The way she smiled while she did it, always just out of Nathan's line of sight. I had spent years absorbing it because I did not want to force Nathan into a corner. He loved her, or he had. And I loved him. I did not want to be the mother who drove a wedge into her son's marriage just because his wife was difficult. But there was a difference between difficult and deliberate. And what Bridget did was always deliberate. I had finally understood that my calmness was not weakness. It never had been. It was the thing she could not plan around, the thing that was slowly undoing every strategy she had built. She expected me to react, to cry, to accuse, to give her something to point at. I never gave her that, and it was driving her to make mistakes. Wesley laid out the full plan the week before the next court session. "We are not going to attack her character in the abstract," he explained, spreading documents across the conference table. "We are going to present a timeline. Specific dates. Specific statements she made to the court versus what the records actually show." He had arranged everything chronologically. The financial transfers, cross-referenced with the dates she had begun telling people I was mentally declining. The testimony from Constance, who had witnessed specific incidents. The signed statement from Bridget's former colleague about the previous false accusation. Each piece on its own could be questioned or explained away. Together, they told a story that had no innocent explanation. "The goal," Wesley said quietly, "is not to destroy her in one moment. It is to show the judge a pattern so clear and so consistent that there is only one reasonable conclusion." He looked at me. "Can you sit calmly through all of it? Even if she reacts?" I thought of 31 years of night shifts, of 2 cancer diagnoses, of burying my husband alone at 44. "Yes," I said simply. "I can." Constance Keller took the stand on a Tuesday morning. She was composed and unhurried. She described specific incidents with dates and details. The night in the driveway, afternoon when she had seen Bridget physically block me from entering Nathan's house when I came to bring Lily a birthday gift, a conversation she had overheard in which Bridget told a mutual friend that she was building a case against me. That last detail landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were visible on every face in the room. Bridget's lawyer objected twice. The judge overruled both times, asking Constance to continue. I sat with my hands folded and my expression neutral and watched the jury of public opinion in that room shift almost imperceptibly but unmistakably toward me. Bridget, seated at her table, was completely still. But her stillness was different from mine. Mine came from patience. Hers looked like someone trying very hard not to shatter. And then she smirked. Just briefly, just at the corner of her mouth. As if she still believed she had something that would save her. It happened again during the afternoon session. Wesley was presenting the financial records, walking the judge through the timeline of transfers, when Bridget stood up from her chair without waiting to be recognized. "This is fabricated," she shouted. "These records have been manipulated. She paid someone to do this." The judge raised one hand. "Sit down." She didn't sit. "She has been lying about me for years. She turned my husband against me. Everything in this room is a lie she constructed." "Sit down." The judge's voice dropped lower, and somehow that made it more commanding. The bailiff moved toward her. She finally sat, breathing hard, her lawyer touching her arm. My heart was hammering, but I did not move. I did not turn to look at Nathan. I kept my eyes forward and my hands still in my lap. The judge called a recess. As people began to move and talk, Wesley leaned toward me. "She just handed us the rest of the case," he said quietly. During the recess, Wesley and I sat in a small side room, and he spread the timeline across the table one more time. It was 15 months of documented contradiction. Every statement Bridget had made to the court had a corresponding record that told a different story. She had told the court she never restricted my access to Lily. Constance's notes showed 4 specific dates on which she had done exactly that. She had told the court the financial transfers were agreed upon by both her and Nathan. Nathan's own bank records showed he had flagged 2 of those transfers as unauthorized. She had told the court I had a history of erratic behavior and confused thinking. My medical records, clean, consistent, reviewed by 2 independent physicians, showed no cognitive impairment of any kind. Every lie had a document sitting quietly beside it waiting. I looked at that timeline and thought of her smirk from earlier in the day. I understood it now. She still believed she had one card left to play. I just had to wait and see what it was. The shift in Nathan happened gradually, and then all at once. He had been watching the financial records go up on the screen with the careful attention of someone who is forcing himself not to look away. I could see it from where I sat, the way his jaw tightened, the way he leaned forward slightly, the way his eyes moved between the documents and Bridget's face. By the end of the afternoon session, something in him had changed. The way he carried himself was different. Heavier and straighter at the same time, if that makes any sense. Bridget noticed. I watched her notice. Her eyes went to him twice in quick succession during a recess, checking him the way you check a structure you are not sure will hold. That evening, I found an envelope that had been slid under the door of my hotel room. There was no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words written in handwriting I did not recognize. Asterisk, she knows you know, asterisk. The following morning, Bridget took the stand. What followed was 40 minutes of the most carefully constructed performance I had ever witnessed. Her voice broke at precise moments. She described my behavior in terms designed to make the listener feel both sympathy for her and quiet concern about me. She spoke about Nathan with tenderness. She spoke about Lily with the practiced grief of someone who had rehearsed it. I sat and listened to all of it. I thought about a patient I had once cared for during my nursing years, a man who had survived something terrible and told me afterward that the hardest part was not the pain. It was staying still when every instinct told him to fight back too soon. The right moment comes, he had said, but only if you wait for it. Wesley leaned over during a pause in her testimony and whispered 2 words, tomorrow morning. I nodded. I folded my hands. I waited. Wesley presented the full evidence package the next morning. He did it without drama, without raised voice, without any theatrical flair. He simply placed each item in front of the court in chronological order and let it speak for itself. The financial transfer records, the dates, the corresponding statements she had made to the court, the medical documentation clearing me of any cognitive decline, Constance's sworn testimony, the signed statement from Bridget's former colleague describing the previous false accusation, Nathan's own bank flagging records. The courtroom was very quiet. When Wesley finished, he stepped back from the podium and said simply, "No further questions, Your Honor." Bridget's lawyer stood to respond, but I could see from across the room that he was working with nothing. His client had built her case on a version of events that the records had now flatly contradicted, piece by piece, in plain public view. Bridget sat at her table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, staring forward. She looked like a person who had just understood, for the first time, that she had run out of moves. Her former friend, a woman named Audra, took the stand that same afternoon. Audra had known Bridget for 11 years before their friendship ended. She was composed and clearly uncomfortable being there, but she had agreed to testify because, as she told Wesley privately, she could not watch an innocent person be destroyed by someone she knew was lying. She described years of behavior. The way Bridget had isolated Nathan from his friends gradually, casually, always with a reasonable-sounding explanation. The way she spoke about me in private versus the warm concern she performed in front of others. A specific incident in which Bridget had admitted, laughing, that she had told Nathan's doctor that I had called the house in a confused state, a call that Audra confirmed had never happened. The gasps in that courtroom were audible. Bridget's composure cracked visibly. Her hands came up from the table. She pressed them flat against her thighs and I watched her breathe through her nose, trying to hold herself together. She was losing. She knew it. And she still had one more move left in her. It came at the start of the following morning session. Before the judge had fully settled, Bridget stood and asked permission to address the court directly. Her lawyer looked alarmed. The judge granted the request with visible caution. She spoke for several minutes. Her voice was quieter than it had been, softer, almost fragile. She talked about the pressure she had been under. She talked about loving Nathan and Lily more than anything. She talked about how hard it was to watch her family being torn apart. And then, without warning, she turned to the gallery and said, "I ask for mercy. From this court, and from a woman who calls herself a mother." She looked directly at me when she said it. The judge let the silence hold for a moment. Then he leaned forward and looked at her steadily. "The court does not operate on appeals to emotion," he said. "It operates on evidence. And the evidence presented in this proceeding has been extensive and consistent." He called for a private credibility hearing to be held later that day. Bridget's lawyer went pale. "I spent that afternoon in the small courthouse garden, sitting on a bench in the thin winter sun. Wesley had told me to rest. There was nothing more for me to do until the hearing reconvened. The case was, in his words, already written. All that remained was the formal conclusion. I thought about Nathan. He had called me the previous evening, not to discuss the case, just to talk. We had spoken for nearly an hour about things that had nothing to do with courts or documents. About a fishing trip we had taken when he was 11. About the way his father used to laugh at his own jokes before anyone else even understood the punchline. It was the longest real conversation we had shared in 3 years. Bridget had not been mentioned once. I thought about what patience had actually cost me. The years of biting my tongue. The dinners I had endured. The times I had swallowed my anger and chosen strategy over reaction. It had been expensive, but I had bought something real with it. I sat in that pale winter sun and waited calmly for the storm to finish. The afternoon session was where everything came together. Wesley presented the final piece, a comprehensive, visual timeline displayed on a large screen. Every contradictory statement Bridget had made, mapped against the corresponding evidence. Every date. Every document. Every witness. The judge studied it for a long time without speaking. Bridget's lawyer tried to interrupt 3 times with procedural objections. Each time, the judge overruled him without looking up from the materials. When Wesley finished, Bridget stood without permission. "I want to explain the transfers," she said quickly. "If you just let me explain." "Ms. Hargrove," the judge said, using her legal name, "you have had ample opportunity to provide explanation. The court has noted your testimony and weighed it against the documentation provided. Please be seated." She sat. I did not feel triumph in that moment. What I felt was closer to exhaustion and relief, the feeling of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. The judge looked at Bridget directly before delivering his preliminary findings. "Do you understand," he said, "the full consequences of what has been presented in this courtroom?" She stared at him. "Do you understand," he continued, "that making false representations to this court regarding another person's mental competence, representations unsupported by any medical evidence and contradicted by documented records, carries serious legal implications?" Her lawyer touched her arm. She shook him off. For one long moment, she looked like she might respond with the same defiance she had shown at the beginning of all this. Her chin came up slightly. Her jaw set. Then something went out of her eyes. Not defeat, exactly. More like the moment a person understands that a door they believed was open has, in fact, been locked for a long time. She said nothing. The judge noted her silence for the record. He announced he would deliver his ruling the following morning. I walked out of that courtroom into the late afternoon air and breathed in slowly, all the way down. The ruling came at 9:15 the next morning. The judge found comprehensively in my favor. He stated clearly that the evidence presented demonstrated a sustained and documented pattern of false characterization, financial misconduct involving funds held in trust, and deliberate misrepresentation to the court. He ordered an immediate freeze on the joint accounts, pending further financial review. He granted me full legal standing in decisions regarding Lily's welfare during the review period. He referred the matter of Bridget's false accusations to a separate body for further review. Bridget sat completely still as he read the ruling. Nathan, seated in the row behind me, reached forward and put his hand briefly on my shoulder. I put my hand over his and held it there for a moment. Bridget's lawyer leaned in to speak to her. She shook her head at whatever he said. Then, quietly and without looking at anyone, she said she intended to appeal. Her lawyer did not look confident about that. Neither did anyone else in the room.